Hello, everyone, and my name is Jennifer Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director of Cassie & Friends, and I'm really excited to be here today and be your host on the Advocating for Your Rheumatic Disease Needs in the Workplace webinar. What makes our webinar so special is this webinar, as all of them, are specifically tailored to the needs of youth and young adults and their families facing rheumatic diseases, and we have an incredible lineup of speakers today, so I'm really excited to get started. Next, please. First of all, I'd love to thank our educational sponsor, Nicola Wealth Management. Nicola Wealth has been an incredible partner to Cassie & Friends for many years and a true champion for the pediatric rheumatic disease community in Canada. Not only are they a sponsor of this session, but they come out and run with us at our Team Cassie & Friends run walks all across Canada. And so we'd like to thank Nicola Wealth very much. Next slide, please. Just before we get started, we always like to just make sure everyone is aware of our extensive virtual education library. And if we just advance to the next slide, you'll see our classroom resources. We have a ton of webinars, but not only that, real patient and family stories. We've indexed the Q&As so that you can find information easily. And there's great information here for every aspect of rheumatic disease, including juvenile idiopathic arthritis, but other rheumatic diseases as well, as you can see on the side. And if you see kind of down the list there, there's a support for youth, which has excellent specific information regarding all aspects of transition. And we look forward to adding the resources shared today to that library. So you can always access it back here at cassieandfriends.ca. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have representation from 33 cities and 3 countries, and I love that everyone is putting their introductions into the chat, and I thought something fun related to this webinar would be to share what your first job was, or if you haven't had a job yet, what you hope that your first job or what you think a cool first job would be. Myself, I sampled Fruitopia, which I don't know if anyone remembers, but it was kind of like Nestea, and I went out to different fairs and gave out samples, and it was a great job. And I was looking in the chat and just seeing that we have such a range of ages represented, parents, young persons. I saw 12-year-olds who might be starting a babysitting job, 16-year-olds, young adults. So I'm so excited for the information that you're going to get here tonight, and it truly applies to everyone. Next slide, please. Just so you know, if you have a question, we will be doing a huge Q&A, open panel Q&A at the end of our presentation. So if you have a question anywhere along the way, please do use the Q&A button, not the chat button, but the Q&A button below. And you can enter your question in there, and we'll be sure to get it out during the session. Next slide, please. Oh my gosh, I'm loving this. So for our first two, I don't know if I saw Natasha's coming through. I'll save that one for later. But our first 2 speakers that we're going to have today on our panel are Dr. Natasha Gakhal and Dr. Evelyn Rozenblyum. Dr. Natasha Gakhal and Dr. Evelyn Rozenblyum are together the amazing juvenile arthritis transition team at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, along with their partners, allied health practitioners. This is our 4th time doing a transition-focused webinar with Dr. Gakhal and Dr. Rozenblyum, and we are just thrilled to not only partner with them in this way to provide transition info, but to learn about their incredible program and the impacts that it's had on youth and young adults transitioning in their care in a truly comprehensive care model to get youth ready to enter the adult world. So we're very excited to now hand the mic over to Natasha and Evelyn.
Thank you for having us again. We always love doing this every year. We're just getting our slides ready. So my first job was in a pizza shop making pizza. So I have a lot of burns to go with that original job. Basically, I was very young, so they all healed very beautifully. So what me and Evelyn are going to talk about today is the nuts and bolts of transition from pediatric to adult care to kind of anchor the conversation around work and what we see in our clinic when it comes to the work-related issues young adults face. Next slide. So we're going to talk about, what does transition really mean? What does it look like across the country? And how can we, as your healthcare professionals and doctors, help you through the work transition that you're also going through? Next slide. So what really is transition? And the best definition we've been able to find, next slide, is that it's a purposeful and planned movement from a child-centric health system to an adult-centric health system. And next slide. And the key here is that it's planned and it's purposeful. So it should be done with a lot of planning and thought in mind. And really, it's about not only how your condition affects you physically, what does it mean to have a flare, joint pain, joint swelling, stiffness, but how does it affect your mental health? How does it affect your social life? How does it affect your reproduction? And what we're going to talk about today is, how does it affect your work and career choices? Next slide. So who transitions? Next slide. So interestingly, not many people know this, but a lot of children transition to the adult healthcare system. So about anywhere from 40 to 70% of children will continue to have some sort of active disease into adulthood, which means they need to have an adult provider moving forward. And so it's really important to provide young adults with the skills to help them navigate this difficult period. Next slide. And there is a lot of feelings that go with this. And the way me and Evelyn look at it is, there's really 4 groups of people and 4 groups of feelings when it comes to transition. So the first and foremost is the patient or the young adult. They feel unprepared, they're scared, they're feeling like they're being abandoned by their pediatric provider. They're kind of going into the unknown. And then there's also the parents. So they also feel abandoned. And what we hear a lot in clinic is, from the parents even, is that their pediatric provider was like a parent to them as well. Particularly if your child has had it since they were very young, you kind of grew up with that pediatric provider. They're scared that their kids won't be able to stand up for themselves, and they're worried that they're going to get pushed to the sidelines. Next slide, please. But we also have lots of feelings as well too. So on the pediatric side, the pediatricians also find it difficult to let go. And if you've been following somebody for 5, 10, 15 years, you're attached as well. And you're worried that they won't get to their appointments. You're worried that that the young adult didn't learn the necessary skills to navigate the adult healthcare system. And then on the adult provider side, we're frustrated. We're like, why can't these young adults get it together? Why is the parent always there? Why are the parents overly involved? Why can't these patients take responsibility? And we sometimes don't realize that the ages of 17 to 24 are very different from our older patients who are 40, 50, 60 years old. Next slide. So why is this transition period so important? So why should we focus on it? Why do we have clinics? Next slide. And it's because research shows that you guys kind of get lost to follow-up. So whether you're referred and you never get there, whether you were never referred, whether you don't show up to your appointments, it's unclear, but we know that we lose a lot of people in this transition period. And we know that your condition can flare during this period. There can be an interruption in medication. So me and Evelyn, lots of time we'll see people urgently only to make sure their meds are continued because there's now a new prescribing physician. And so it's really an effort to kind of consolidate care, and hopefully this transition will be seamless. Next slide. So when does the transition happen? Next slide. So as we stated before, it's a process. It's not an event. It doesn't happen in one time period or one visit. And if it's done well, it's started early, sometimes as early as 12 or 13 years old. So next slide. So we spend a lot of time talking starting at the age of 12 or 13 about the condition and the treatments. How do you manage a flare before you need to call a doctor? How do you deal with increases in joint pain, swelling, or stiffness? When do you call the doctor? So having those advocacy skills early on and being able to stand up for yourself. And we know there's lots of different things happening at this age. So sometimes it's about learning one thing at a time and not everything at once. Next slide. And so once again, it's a process. Not all the skills need to be learned at once. Slowly over time, you'll learn the skills and become more comfortable with them. That's why we would like to start early at age 12 or 13 in the pediatric clinics. So we have several years to build on this and address anything that we know that you need and you may not have. Next slide. So where do you transition to? So next slide. So the adult healthcare system does look different than the pediatric system, and this is sometimes a shock to young adults and parents. So adult clinics are busier. So even if you go into the waiting room, much busier than on the pediatric side because adults get sick more often, unfortunately. And we don't tend to have the group of providers that they do on the pediatric side. So we may not have a nurse, we may not have therapists at our disposal. We just don't have those resources sometimes. One of the big things for rheumatology specifically is that joint injections are performed in the clinic right away. So we don't take you into a surgical suite. We do it with you awake and at the bedside. And then diagnostic imaging like CTs, MRIs, X-rays may be done differently on the adult side. Next slide. And so that's really where transition clinics come in, which is really to address the stark difference between pediatric clinics and adult clinics. And we're trying to kind of be the hybrid in between. Next slide. And so really what transition clinics offer that strictly adult clinics don't offer is it's really providing a linkage. So it's having people that have an expertise and an interest, particularly in this time period. They're willing to address other things other than just disease flares. So, you know, your mental health, your reproduction, what we're going to talk about today, your work and school issues. We can also help you link you with other specialists. So if you were supposed to see a cardiologist or a gastroenterologist but never got there, we can make sure that those linkages happen. We spend a lot of time linking people up with family doctors because for a lifetime, your family doctor has really been your pediatric rheumatologist. And on the adult side, you do need a separate family doctor. And we stay connected to your pediatric providers. So we talk with your pediatric providers to get that information of all the years that you were with them. Next slide. So how do young adults transition to adult care? And I think I'll hand it over to Evelyn at this point.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natasha, for that great overview. And I'll just handle a bit of how it happens, the transition across Canada, as well as some more work-related and education-related processes that we see in our clinic. My first job I mentioned in the chat was a telemarketer for window and door replacement. So apologies if I called your house, especially during dinner time. That's usually when we call. All right, so in terms of transition models across Canada, so there are many transition clinics. When I first sort of started my training years ago, there were only 4, and then there really popped up, we really found that there was a big need to have more structured transition clinics around the country. So now there's more formal transition programs. Just for a few examples, I saw there's someone on the call from McMaster. So there they usually have one of our ACPAC physiotherapy practitioners who helps to coach the young people into the adult world, and they have the adult practitioner come to the pediatric clinic in advance. There's someone from Vancouver, so our clinic is modeled on theirs. someone from Calgary. So in Calgary, usually the pediatric provider goes to the adult center for the first visit with the patient. They have a nice meet and greet, and then they hand over the care to the adult provider. So it really works differently in many of the centers. So there's really three basic models. There's a direct transition, where you go from the pediatric care, then you do a direct referral or transfer of care just directly to the adult rheumatologist. And often this happens if your case is fairly straightforward. I saw there was someone in Barrie, so the Barrie Hospital doesn't have a specific transition program, but if you're doing well, they may just transfer you to someone else in Barrie who can handle your care. There's a progressive transition where you're in pediatric care, then you have combined visits at the pediatric site, combined visit at the adult site, and then you move on. And then there's the share care transition C, which is what Natasha and I do in our clinic at Women's College. And so really what we do, so I'm the pediatric provider, Natasha's the adult provider, and then we also have an advanced therapist. We see and discuss the patients all together, and we take turns looking at them. We bring each other in and out. It's like a lovely dance that we do during clinic so that every patient's needs are addressed. We focus on, of course, managing the disease, but also the non-medical areas as well in terms of school and work and general transition issues like finding a family doctor, as Natasha mentioned. So work issues during transition, what we see in clinic. So I'm always amazed by the young people who we see in clinic. They do such fabulous things. I think some of the coolest jobs we've heard of, like an elevator repair person, that was like top 5, 10 for sure. We see engineers, IT people, bricklayers, you name it, hostesses at restaurants, whatever the case may be. So we see it all. What the literature shows us here, there's a few studies quoted, and the employment status of patients with JIA, specifically juvenile arthritis, has a very large range. If the disease is more active, of course, you'll have a harder time working, trying to find work, attending school, those kind of things. The types of work factor in for feasibility. So, if you have quite debilitating hand arthritis, maybe piano playing is not for you, and maybe it is. And, you get a good physiotherapy and occupational therapy and you're fine, but you sort of have to see where your areas of tension are in the body and see what's best for you. Sometimes there's mood issues as well, for suffering in silence and feeling like you can't speak out. And disclosing your diagnosis often provokes anxiety. So there was a qualitative study where they asked patients with juvenile arthritis their feelings around disclosing to the work. And some of the big themes that brought out were, some of the big themes that came up were not wanting to be perceived as different, fearing discrimination, not expecting to benefit from disclosing, and finding JIA just to be hard to explain. And so underneath, I'll just share an example. I just didn't want any extra help from anyone. I didn't want to be singled out as a person who wanted help or needed help. Or something here, not expecting to benefit. I'm not going to bother going through the hassle and embarrassment for them, or the employer, to go no. So, just some snippets of quotes, which I'm happy to share later as well. And they're available in the article, just to feel if you guys have any of those types of feelings, you're not alone. Like a lot of people have these similar feelings as well. So how can we, or your healthcare providers, help with your work life? So first of all, our guidelines for transition, these are guidelines that were published from Europe and the European Society for Rheumatic Diseases in 2016. And they really make a mention that in our transition process in clinics, we address medical, psychological, and education and vocational attributes. And stay tuned for our Canadian guidelines, because we're also going to be focusing on that as well. In addition, the better we help you control your disease and prevent flares, the better able and physically able and energetic you are to pursue all your life's dreams and desires, and improves your daily functioning, and we also help you deal with medication issues. And so we make sure your disease is well controlled. We can help advocate on your behalf by writing letters, speaking to employers. We can link you to people and resources that can help. And we're also here for your emotional and social support, someone to talk to. So in terms of advocating on your behalf, like we said, we could communicate with your employer by giving accommodation and requesting time off if needed or modified duties. And then linking to people who can help would be occupational therapists, physiotherapists, social workers, mental health supports, and online resources. And of course, for the emotional and social support, we've been around for a while, and we've seen a lot of patients, held a lot of patients. Your case may be unique, and then we'll just learn together if it is unique. And we could also share experience of what we've learned from others. And we get it, and we know, and we're here for you. And so in summary, transition from pediatric to adult care is happening really at a very busy time when your whole lives are being turned upside down and you're getting new providers. The goal of transition is not just to get you to adult care, but it's to make sure that your disease is well controlled, you're taking your meds if you need them, and all the work-life balance, work-life aspects of your life are taken care of, and we can help you address that. Thank you very much.
That was just amazing. Thank you, Natasha and Evelyn, for breaking it down in that way and really laying an amazing groundwork to introduce our next speakers. And it really touched me on that suffering and silence piece, because I think silence can also be isolation. And you think of like a first job as really like by yourself entering in, but you made it really clear about the various supports that can be provided through rheumatology care. And I found that quite amazing to see it that way and not to feel kind of alone in that situation. It was also an amazing foundation to now move into our next speaker, Alison Legge, who is here to share really a real life experience and to talk about that transition period in how that was for her and her experience. Alison has been an incredible advocate and member of the Cassie and Friends community for many, many years, and was actually part of our initial sort of look into working with rheumatic disease and the impact on youth. She was born in Vancouver, BC, and obtained her bachelor's in computer science and applied math from the University of Oregon, graduating in 2018. She then returned to Vancouver, but was only here for a few years before she relocated to England. And she currently works as a senior data specialist at the Lego Group. I will let Alison tell her first job all on her own, because everyone seems to get quite a bit of delight sharing it. But in her spare time, because we're all of the things that Evelyn and Natasha explained, all the components of life, Alison likes to be found on the golf course. She is often found curled up on the floor reading with her dog Jovo, and also currently has been exploring all the London's pub scene has to offer. And with that, I welcome Alison to come on.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you for having me. Give me a second, and I'm going to just share my screen here. Okay. Yeah, so thank you again for having me, and thank you to everyone for being here. As Jennifer kind of read a little bit about my bio, I really struggle to introduce myself because I never know what to include, whether it's my resume or my journey with arthritis or my hobbies and interests. So I also thought I would start this with a little bit about me. As Jennifer noted, I graduated in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in computer science and applied math. After graduation, I moved back to Vancouver, where I was born and raised, and started a job as a fan insights data analyst for Canuck Sports and Entertainment. I do love hockey, but I very quickly realized that the industry was not for me, and I wanted to get into a job in a more data-informed industry. So I basically fell into gaming, but I will be the first person to tell you that I'm not a gamer. I left my job at CSC when I got a job as a data analyst at Hothead Games in 2019. It was initially 5 days a week in the office till COVID hit in 2020, and we went fully remote. I loved my job. I loved the city of Vancouver, but I had watched my older sister move to New York in 2018 for a job at a tech company, and I kind of wanted to prove to myself that I could do it too, despite my illness. So in March of 2021, I applied for a role as a technical account manager for gaming partners at Snapchat based in London. I moved to London 3 months later with my dog Jovo and 2 suitcases. And I left in April 2023, I left Snapchat after the rollout of the return to office policy, and I joined the Lego group as a senior data specialist for Lego Game. When it comes to my journey with arthritis, I was diagnosed at 3 years old. My arthritis never manifested itself in classic ways, meaning there was never a ton of swelling or markers in my blood. So I kind of spent my entire childhood walking this line between being too sick and not sick enough. But my parents never let me use it as an excuse. I do still remember those times that I was accused of making up my pain for attention. I was 7 the first time I remember it came from a doctor, and I still remember standing in the hallway of my of my high school when my grade 9 gym teacher made a snide remark about how the fact that I could play hockey but couldn't participate in gym class. Thankfully, my parents never wavered in their support, and they pushed me to advocate for myself. My arthritis was relatively controlled with the exception of my jaw. When I was 16, I had my jaw reconstructed to undo the damage caused by arthritis. All was fine until I woke up one day about a year later in debilitating pain, and that was caused by the degeneration of both jaw joints. At the time, there were no surgeons in Canada doing jaw joint replacements and very few globally. So for the 5 years that followed and throughout my degree, I survived on a cocktail of medications, including opiate patches and pills, multiple antidepressants, and some benzodiazepines. Finally, at 22, I was lucky enough to find a surgeon in the US that was covered by my student medical insurance, and I underwent a successful bilateral jaw joint replacement that completely changed my life and has led me to here. The replacement meant that I was no longer living with debilitating chronic pain, and it allowed me to build the life I currently lead and to make an international move. So these days, when I'm not working, I can be found running or on the golf course. I travel, which is key since I live abroad. I joined a choir. I will spend my weekends with friends going to music festival shows or walking around central London as Lord Farquaad. And most importantly, I take care of my 5-year-old dog, Jovo, who moved from Vancouver with me. I also want to note that none of this would be possible if I didn't have flexibility in my work. So what does flexible work really look like? While I was at Snap, I would be in the office about 3 to 4 times a week for 3 to 5 hours at a time. I would go to the gym at lunch. I could block out time for appointments without having to share any details. I could work from anywhere, which often included hospital waiting rooms because doctors never seem to run on time. And lastly, I could work from home during the day and still have energy to attend company socials or team events outside of working hours. The flexibility allowed me to excel in my role while keeping my health at the forefront. I managed to take part in different extracurriculars or like employee resource groups, and I continuously hit deadlines and exceeded what was expected of me in my role. So what happened? I couldn't figure out the animations on this slide, so they're all in one space. But during my interview process with Snapchat, I chose at that point to be transparent about my arthritis because I wasn't just changing jobs, but I was moving continents. I was told that Snap was operating on a remote first policy. So 3 months later, I up and moved myself and my dog Jovo from living in my parents' house in North Vancouver to a brand new flat in a brand new country in London. In November of 2022, the CEO sent out a company-wide email mandating all employees to return to office for 80% of the work week, backtracking on his remote first policy. I was told that there was going to be a medical exception process as a formality, but it was unclear of what it would entail. So I submitted a request anyways. It turned out that that process was long, extremely stressful, flawed, and quite frankly, a bit disturbing. For example, it wasn't enough for me to provide certified medical records from medical professionals who had treated me for a lifetime because they were coming from Canada. They were conducting the medical exception process like it was an investigation or a suspicious medical claim. So what kind of left me to leave? I have what I would call crippling health-related imposter syndrome from years of being told I don't look sick or I'm not sick enough. So I find I spend a lot of my time trying to prove that being physically absent doesn't make me any less capable. As I went through this process with Snap, I felt as though the burden was being put on me to prove that I was actually sick, but not sick enough that it would hinder me from doing my job. When SNAP started introducing more and more hoops to jump through for this medical exception process, I realized that no matter what I did or how I showed up, it wouldn't be enough to hit the arbitrary attendance policy they had put in place. From experience, I know it's quite hard for colleagues or managers to understand how someone can be in the gym 5 days a week or socialize after work, but can't do an 8-hour day in the office. I also didn't trust my manager or the culture at the company. I had heard multiple times people say that, oh, that person won't be promoted because they're never in the office. And that was even before the policy came into effect. The introduction of this policy and what followed also had a direct impact on my mental and physical health. My arthritis flared for the first time in 2 years. And I kept trying to voice this to my manager, my director, and HR, that the process was incredibly dehumanizing and completely ignored individuality. Their response was to tell me that it wasn't personal, but I couldn't quite understand how someone could tell me that my own health wasn't personal. I felt like I was kind of being shown the door, so I basically showed myself out. When I resigned, I knew there was nothing they could say or do to stop me from leaving because ultimately I didn't feel safe. I didn't trust that there was the systems were in place to protect me. I didn't trust my manager, and I didn't really feel like there was an opportunity for me at the company any longer. When I left, I made sure to sit down with the VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as my director, to share how the process directly led to my resignation, and that if the company cares about their people, they need to fix it. So talking to your employer and having these conversations is not easy. And I wanted to take some time to highlight just a few things that I learned along the way that I kept in mind and that I will keep in mind moving forward. So before I spoke with anyone and before I speak to anyone, I make a list of what my non-negotiables are. And in this case, it was flexible work was one of them. I didn't really trust my manager or HR, so I made it a point to document all the conversations I had. And if you don't trust the person that you're reporting into directly, talk to someone you trust first to get what I would call a vibe check on the situation. And don't be afraid to bring in someone to act as a third party or to even ask if you can record the conversation. A paper trail goes a really long way to ensure that requests are fulfilled and to also hold people accountable. As it isn't always possible to get everything in writing, if you've had a face-to-face meeting, offer to send a follow-up after the meeting and ask that they acknowledge that when it's been received. When scheduling these meetings, schedule them at a time that works for you. I found them to be incredibly triggering and they often left me quite upset. So I would schedule them through either the end of my workday or I would ensure I had no meetings or any deliverables or deadlines following any conversation around my illness. Brief your support system so that they're prepared to support you. This is not an easy journey. They're not easy conversations to have. And unfortunately, they can take a lot longer than you'd expect. Lastly, understand your rights. So I can only speak to the UK as that's where I'm currently living, but I'm pretty sure that this is a place to, there's other people in this call that are qualified to speak about it in Canada. But the UK has what they call the right to request flexible work, where employers are required to deal with requests in a reasonable manner. So as the outcome of the medical exception process was becoming more and more unclear at SNAP, I started to look at other opportunities. And I wanted to kind of outline some of the steps that I took to find the right fit. So before putting forth any applications, I thought really hard about what was important to me in my next opportunity. I then established what I was comfortable with disclosing about my illness, as well as the reasons why I was leaving. I researched the companies I was applying to, and when interviews came around, I asked a lot of questions. So I started with what was important to me. I also apologize, there were no bullet points. There were no animations on the slide. I couldn't figure it out with the bullet points. But when I was leaving SNAP, I knew that the following were important. It needed to be the right job at the right company. Flexible work environment, as well as, so including hours and location were a must. And I also knew I was willing to reduce my income and give up some benefits that I didn't always, but now kind of saw as frivolous. I do kind of think that at this point, a fitness allowance wouldn't do me any good if I was too tired to go to the gym. After I figured out what was important to me, I decided what I wanted to disclose. Unlike when I was interviewing for SNAP, I actually chose not to disclose my arthritis in my interview stages with the Lego group. Instead, I chose to ask more pointed questions about company culture and the company's remote work policy and expected hours. I was open about the fact that I was leaving SNAP because of the return to office policy, and I stressed that flexible work for me was more than just a perk or a nice to have. I do choose to include a volunteer experience section on the second page of my CV. And if I'm ever asked about it, I'm happy to speak about my experience and why it matters to me. This kind of lets me control the narrative a bit more. And from there, if I feel comfortable, I can disclose. I did end up telling my manager about 3 months after I started, but it was very much after we had established a level of trust. Another important step to finding the right fit is to do your research. Thought I'd mix up the slides with an image this time. I've seen many companies and job descriptions that boast about their flexible work policies. However, employers sometimes think that requiring employees in the office less than 5 days a week is enough to call a job flexible. But a good flexible work policy should allow for employees not just to define where they work, but how and when, to a certain degree as well. I'm also a bit wary about jobs where they list flexible work as a perk. So while asking these questions is important, you can please use the internet. It is your friend in these situations. Make sure you're familiar with the job description and the company that you're interested in working for. A lot of companies these days have careers pages that will talk about their work benefits and life at the company. And it is almost always there where they include information on whether it's a hybrid or remote or an in-office policy. Aside from that, look at websites like Glassdoor, Indeed, or even Reddit and Quora. Every company will have a few bad reviews, but just look for repeated trends. Last but not least, ask the right questions. So asking questions is really hard, especially when you really want the job and when you're pretty new into the job market. However, a job interview is just as much your chance to interview your prospective employer as it is for them to interview you. So use the time to get the right questions and get a sense check of the company. You can kind of ask questions in a bit of a direct or indirect way. So if you don't want to ask straight up what the in-office or flexible work policy is, you could ask about what the office attendance is on now and mandatory days. That will give an idea of are people coming in? Are they required? Is there a kind of an unspoken rule that you should be in more than your what's required? Ask about the policy and if it allows for flexibility in timings and days. One question I always like to ask is, does your company have core hours? So meaning, are you expected to be online between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., or can you be online between 10 and 4 and the rest of your time is how you choose to work? Ask about sick days, because this will be relevant, and ask if medical appointments or stepping out need to be disclosed to your manager, and if they also you need to take a sick day for that to count it as a sick day. And lastly, ask about what kind of workplace accommodations can be made. What kind of equipment will you be provided with? Is it a desk where you'd have a set desk and you can set your computer set up to something that works for you? Or are you doing my company right now, hot desks, so no one has an assigned desk? And I actually find that quite stressful. So during my interview process at Lego, I also chose to ask everyone from the recruiter, the hiring manager, to the director what the remote work policy was. Because asking both the recruiter and then as well as the direct team, it gave me a bit of a better idea of what the policy is on a company level, but as well as how it's enforced. The Lego group right now operates on a best of both hybrid policy, and which requires employees in the office 3 days a week. But my manager understands that this isn't possible for me and has been clear that since the interview process that he doesn't care how or when my work gets done, as long as I'm in the office if I need to be. So for face-to-face meetings, I deliver on my timelines, and I'm also not blocking anyone else's ability to do their job. He told me that in the interview a year ago, and that is still very much how we operate. I want to just to wrap this up. I wanted to kind of highlight a few things that I've learned along the way. All questions are fair game. Ask about policies, benefits, the company culture. Ask before, rather than when you've signed on the dotted line. And if that's what a company chooses not to hire you based on is because you ask too many questions, that is probably not a sign of a good company culture. These days I go in about 1 to 3 days a week for half days, and I haven't faced any pushback or issues, but I also better know my rights and my options. And I know that the way I operate at the Lego Group could change if my manager were to leave or if the company were to start enforcing the policy. So I already have the UK's right to flexible work bookmarked and have told my manager that if anything changes, I'm ready to submit. I would say your relationship with your direct manager is the most important relationship in your work life, full stop. I wouldn't accept a job without having met the hiring manager. Lastly, no job, no matter the pay or the title, is worth putting your health in jeopardy. Ultimately, my experience at Snapchat taught me a lot about myself and my self-worth. These are a few of the things that I learned along the way and what worked for me, but it's by no means a manual of what will work for everyone. If you take anything away from this presentation, I hope it's that you feel empowered, and on hard days or the days where you feel like you're fighting on your own, remember you have more power than you think, and you have an entire community behind you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. I really, really loved actually what you said about like what constitutes a benefit. And I think that's something that could really stick with everyone, regardless if you have a rheumatic disease or not, but in terms of just value-based employment decisions. And you articulated your experience so well. And I know Natasha and Evelyn talked about that young adult period being such a unique and like tumultuous time. And you went through one of the biggest changes in the world of work that have ever happened. So it's amazing. And I really thank you for being here to share your story today. And in talking about changes of work, we really couldn't have a better segue into our next speaker. So Dr. Arif Jetha is the Associate Scientific Director for the Institute for Work and Health, and we have been a proud collaborator with Dr. Jetha for many years, including an initial project where we engaged youth to give some feedback into working with a rheumatic condition. Dr. Jetha's specific research program really synthesizes all of the characteristics that make up the future of work and how they affect the health and employment of vulnerable workers, but with an extra focus on youth and young adults with chronic disease. He is currently the recipient of a STARS Career Development Salary Award from the Arthritis Society, and just a wonderful collaborator with Cassie and Friends. So with that, take the lead, Arif.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be speaking today. I'm just going to pull up my slides, and can you see my slide deck?
Yes, you just have to go
Yes.
full screen.
Oh, sorry, it's not full screen?
No, it's just in the like when you open up PowerPoint, that view.
Oh, darn.
Maybe go play from start on the top left.
Oh, I see. It disconnected. Okay, how about now?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. I'm sorry, everyone. I've had like a very busy day, and and I am so excited to be speaking to all of you. And so, as was mentioned, I do a lot of research at the Institute for Work and Health, which is a not-for-profit research organization, and we're affiliated with the University of Toronto. And a lot of the information that we collect at the Institute pretty much aligns with a lot of the insights that have been shared by our first set of speakers. In particular, a lot of Alison's experiences align with what we hear in research and in data. So I'm going to bring a perspective that kind of complements the previous presenters. So I think one thing that I want to highlight to everyone on this call is that not only does your health shape your work, but your work shapes your health. Work provides access to income and a number of resources that shape health, and data from like the last century show that the highest earning Canadians live 3 to 8 years longer than the lowest earners. So obviously that's a kind of like a broad data source, but it just goes to show that when you're in a better job, it's going to shape your health. Another point I want to highlight is we spend most of our time at work. If you're able to find a stable full-time job, you're spending about 1/5 of your waking hours at work. And so you really need to be selective about the type of job that you choose, and your employers, like Alison mentioned, and your supervisors, they all play a critical role in determining your career trajectory. But we're living in kind of this uncertain economic times. Access to full-time stable employment, it's hard to come by. Many of us, or many young people in particular, will start their jobs in precarious, unstable, unsecure work. And this can have a significant impact, especially for young people living with rheumatic conditions who require health benefits, who require different types of flexibility and supports. And so starting work in this unpredictable and precarious situation can be quite challenging for young people. And that's something to think about as you're starting your career, that you might not start in this stable, secure job that many of us envision working in. Another key point I want to highlight, and this kind of aligns with what Alison had mentioned, is that many young people who we talk to have productive careers, and they're able to have to make a good income and have enough resources to support a really strong quality of life. But another point that I want to highlight, and this is from population level data from across Canada, and that is that people living with rheumatic conditions are less likely to be in the labor force when compared to those without any sort of health condition. And so having a rheumatic condition does impact your ability to stay employed and maintain your ability to be productive across the working life course. And that's another critical point to highlight. We consistently find in our data that when you do find work, people living with rheumatic conditions, with arthritis, with juvenile arthritis, are more likely to report missing work days because of their health, a phenomenon we call absenteeism. They're more likely to report working while unwell, and they face job disruptions not only to attending work, but during the workday, as Alison mentioned in her talk. What we've also recently found is that people living with rheumatic conditions are more likely to report job insecurity. So they feel like they're not really connected to their job. They can lose their job at any moment. Their job is a stressful aspect of their life, and that can be quite challenging for their health and well-being. Alison mentioned a number of themes regarding how rheumatic disease can impact work. So I'm not going to talk about all of these elements, but one kind of aspect that I really want to bring to light is the episodic nature of a rheumatic condition. And many of you probably have experienced this directly or through your child or through your personal experiences. And that is like, this is not a static condition. It can fluctuate, meaning sometimes it can be quite severe and sometimes it's quite controllable. Obviously, that's quite challenging for the person themselves, but it can create really complex situations at work. And as Alison mentioned, it can be quite challenging for someone to understand that, oh, you're okay right now, but 2 days ago you were complaining about your pain or fatigue. And that can create challenges in terms of requesting accommodations or requesting support at work, or feeling like people can provide you with the empathy or support that you need. Similarly, a rheumatic condition in many cases is invisible. People just can't tell that you have it. And this is particularly challenging for young people when they say, well, I have juvenile arthritis. And the response is, well, I thought arthritis was a condition of elderly people. That tends to be a consistent message that we hear when folks talk about their condition at work. Another theme that I want to highlight, and Alison also mentioned this, which is the role of mental health. And what we're seeing now is that it's not just the rheumatic disease symptoms that can interrupt work, but oftentimes the co-occurrence of a mental health condition like depression or anxiety combined with symptoms of a rheumatic condition, that can have the most significant impact on work. And that kind of brings to light the importance of managing your mental health, in addition to all the other self-management aspects of your life. And similarly, as was talked about in terms of transitioning to pediatric care, there's also transitioning to other parts of your life, like finding a partner or moving out of your house. The balance that comes with balancing work, health, and personal life can be a stressor for many. In this last little bit of my presentation, I'm going to highlight what we hear about when it comes to actually accessing support or resources at work that can allow individuals or young people with arthritis to stay employed and have really productive and fulfilling career experiences. And obviously, Alison talked a lot about supervisor support and awareness, coworker support and awareness, and that can be critical, and we hear that quite a bit. One point to highlight is that a majority of supervisors or coworkers have never worked, or they've never knowingly worked with someone living with a rheumatic condition. And as a result, they don't know what is required to support those types individuals with these types of conditions. And so there's a bit of education sometimes that's required if you do decide to talk about your condition at work. There's a bit of capacity building on what you cannot do. And as Alison mentioned, sometimes that requires a bit of advocacy. As I'll speak to a little bit later, job accommodations and benefits is a critical discussion when it comes to supporting people living with rheumatic conditions and arthritis at work, and I'll talk to that a little bit later. What we've found is that folks living with rheumatic conditions really struggle with the decision to disclose or communicate their health needs at work. At the Institute, we don't necessarily promote the decision to disclose. Rather, we promote the thought that people take time to think about the pros and cons of disclosure and what that could mean for your relationships at work, your ability to access support, as well as your career progression. A theme that I want to highlight, and again, I'm going through this pretty quickly, but I'm happy to talk more about some of these themes in greater depth moving forward, is that the work environment is changing, and it's changing quite quickly. The digital transformation of the economy and the growing use of technology has meant that persons living with disabilities, people living with chronic health conditions, are able to utilize technology to better manage their working lives. That can come with a cost as well. As Alison mentioned, sometimes you're excluded from career progression opportunities. You might not have the support that comes with working in an office, and that can be quite isolating for many people. So I think the changing world of work can create both challenges and opportunities that we should be aware of moving forward. So with regards to the concept of job accommodations and benefits, when we've collected survey data on this topic, what we consistently find is that the need for extended health benefits is critical for young people living with rheumatic conditions. And that's not surprising. Obviously, the need for pharmaceutical care, extended health benefits, allied health care, that's critical and often informs or kind of enhances someone's career experiences. Obviously, if you have medication and drugs and treatment, you're more likely to manage your health and more likely to sustain employment. Another key point that I want to highlight is, in addition to kind of more tangible accommodations like specialized equipment at work, many folks also report that a lot of the accommodations they need are quite cost effective and in some cases low cost. Flexible hours, that's something that an employer can provide, and it doesn't really eat into their bottom line. The ability to alter your schedule, take more rest, as long as you're getting your work done. These are kind of aspects of work that, if you're in the right work environment with the right supportive employer, they're low cost, they allow you to work, and they allow you to still manage your health. Another kind of key theme that we consistently hear is that despite the need for these different job accommodations and benefits, despite the fact that they might exist within the work environment, what we often hear is that many young people are not using them. So there's kind of this discrepancy between need availability and use, with use being quite a bit lower than what's available. And that's a critical gap, because you might be leaving resources, accommodations on the table, and we need to think about that a bit more. One reason folks are often not accessing job accommodations and benefits is because they're not communicating their health needs. And again, I'm not advocating for folks to go and disclose to their employer, because as Alison mentioned, if your employer is not supportive, if the vibe is not one that is conducive to managing your health, you might be met with a negative reaction. And so that's important to highlight. But on the kind of counter to that, what we consistently see is that those who've disclosed are more likely to report that their accommodation needs are either exceeded or met within their work environment. So there are some benefits to communicating your needs at work. And maybe that's not disclosing the full details of your health condition, but it also could be about communicating your limitations or what you can and cannot do. When we talk to folks, we hear testimonials about their experiences disclosing to their colleagues and some of the negative reactions that they get. Many people feel that they're fearful that if they do disclose, they'll be seen as a big complainer. And that can be quite a struggle for many folks, especially when they need to get extra accommodations. It can be particularly important when you're starting your career and you're wanting to prove yourself. To be seen in that negative light can be quite challenging. And Alison really, again, brought that to life through her experiences. People often, when they disclose or they communicate, they get met with the response, "Oh, you're too young for arthritis." Again, this invisibility aspect, the fact that it fluctuates, that's quite challenging for many young people. And I think it's important to highlight that that creates huge complexity in terms of accessing support at work. So I'm going to leave you with a couple kind of resources that we've designed at the Institute, one of which was designed by my colleague Monique Gignac at the Institute. And she's created several communication resources that are free to use. They can be accessed from our Institute's website, and the URL is on the top left-hand corner. And I'm going to highlight two specific tools. The first is the Decide tool, which is a decision support tool to help you work through the decision of whether to share any information with about your disability or your health needs with others at work. So whether or not it's a good environment to do that. And the second tool, the JDAPT, helps workers with chronic and episodic health conditions and workplace parties who support them identify accommodations tailored to job demands that allow workers to successfully stay in their jobs. And these tools are being created in conjunction with the Arthritis Society and other health charities focused on episodic health conditions. And I think one of the biggest goals of these tools is to be proactive. Oftentimes what we hear is that people don't disclose or communicate their needs until there's a health crisis. And we want to avoid that. We want to be proactive. We want to be preventative. We want to get supports and resources that can help prevent a flare or prevent pain or fatigue from worsening. Also, we want to avoid the medicalization of disclosure. It's all about what you can and cannot do at work, and that should be the real focus of discussion: limitations, abilities, and then working with your employer to identify and integrate supports into your workplace practices. And then very lastly, I just wanted to highlight that we had worked with Cassie and Friends prior to the pandemic on an interactive tool that just kind of flags some of the key issues that we think young people should be thinking about when they're looking for work, or when they have a job, or when they're not able to work, the types of supports and considerations that should be taken into account. And we would encourage you to go on the website and take a look at this tool. And I would also highlight to the Cassie and Friends folks that make time to update this tool to align with kind of our current working realities. So with that, I just wanted to highlight that my contact information is here, and also acknowledge the Arthritis Society who supports my research, and happy to take questions after the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Arif. Well, I am sure you were an amazing pretzel maker. You've gone on to contribute some amazing work and research and information that is truly like going to transform the lives of young people with rheumatic disease as they navigate these situations. So I want to thank you so much for that. And though I do like pretzels. So our next speaker is Saneliso Moyo. Saneliso is a partner at Goldblatt Partners LLP in Toronto. And Dr. Jetha really shared a little bit about the changing world of work and all of the aspects to consider on how our employment is affected. Saneliso is really going to tell us today about what our rights are and how that works from a legal perspective. And as a lover of storytelling herself, Saneliso believes that as a litigator, her job is to help her clients tell their story, and that through that storytelling, she can help unions and workers enforce their rights and make change. I think that's the most inspiring bio I've ever read. So with that, please welcome and help me welcome Saneliso.
Thank you so much. Let me get my slides up here. All right. And just make my notes in front of me so that I can feel like I'm looking at you folks in the Zoom boxes. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I will be talking about what your rights are in terms of accommodation and addressing your needs with respect to illness in the workplace. You know, as a lawyer, I have to start off by saying that nothing that I'm saying today constitutes legal advice. And I see that there are some questions in the Q&A already that I'm hoping some of my presentation will address. And I'm happy to take other questions. I just have to also say that I can't answer any specific questions that folks may have about specific circumstances. But I will do my best to provide some general information or to point you folks in the direction where you can get specific information if there are specific questions that people have. So, know your rights. You know, the first place I thought that we should start thinking about, and I think Alison touched on this as well as Arif in their talk, about where to start when you have any sort of question about workplace accommodations, about how to navigate the workplace, whether it's about appointments or needing sick days or time off for more extended purposes. So I would say in any workplace, whether you are working at McDonald's or working at the mall, as most of my first jobs were, or if you're working in an office, tech startup, whatever the case may be, try and make yourself familiar or at least know where your employer's policies and directives are around accommodation, human rights more generally, sick days or sick leave, right? Those are the things that are going to be the starting point for any questions that you might have and that you might want to pose to your employer. And I think having that information before you go to them is always very helpful. If you work in a unionized working environment, so that could be a grocery store, that could be working for a provincial or federal government organization, or many other workplaces. If there's a union in place that represents you and other workers, know who that union is, know who your shop steward is on the floor of your workplace, know what your collective agreement says, right? There are often terms and clauses in collective agreements or even in individual employment contracts that deal with accommodation, that deal with human rights, and those will also be useful guides as a starting point. The other piece to know is what your local human rights legislation or policies are. So I'm in Ontario. Ontario and every other province and territory in Canada has human rights legislation. There is also federal legislation that applies to federal organizations. So if you work for the government of Canada in any of its forms and varieties, you would be covered by federal legislation. If you work for a private employer or for a provincial or territorial government, then you would be covered by provincial legislation. So in Ontario, the Ontario Human Rights Code prohibits discrimination on the basis of a number of protected grounds, one of which is disability, and disability in most Canadian jurisdictions includes illness or injury. So arthritis would fall under disability and would be something which creates a scheme of rights that would govern your workplace interactions with your employer. The Ontario Human Rights Tribunal and the Human Rights Commission have developed really, really useful tools and directives online for all sorts of human rights, but in particular for navigating human rights around disability and accommodation in the workplace. So those are also places where you might want to think about a starting point for information. And then obviously, if you feel like there is a personal or individual situation that needs to be addressed, consulting with a lawyer is always a good idea. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to go to court or to a human rights tribunal to fight your case. But I often meet with folks where really it's just a conversation that they need to have to understand the specifics in their circumstances and what their rights are. That can be quite helpful in helping them think about their next steps and how to navigate tricky situations in the workplace. So that was just the primer, but the three sort of areas I want to cover today are around sick days or sick leave and accommodation, the types of information your employer is entitled to, and therefore what information you can refuse or decline to offer, and then what are some tips for how to be your best advocate from a legal perspective. I think both Alison and Arif did a great job of getting us thinking about those things. And my presentation might be a bit of a downer because I might temper folks a little bit in terms of what your rights actually likely are in Canadian jurisdictions at least. But I think taking all of our presentations together should give you a pretty good sense and some pretty good tools about how to advocate for yourself or how to assist your loved ones to advocate on their own path in the workplace. So sick days. I think sick days and sick leave are a good starting point because that sort of usually and often the sort of first place where a disclosure of some sort of need may be made by most people. And I know I saw a couple of different questions in the Q&A about whether or not folks should disclose to an employer prior to getting a job their illness. From my perspective as a lawyer, the answer to that question will always be no. You have no legal obligation to disclose to an employer a disability, illness, or injury, and your rights in terms of being accommodated only begin at the point in which you are employed by that employer. And so my recommendation to anyone would be to not disclose at the outset and to, once you are in the workplace, once you are employed, once you have signed a contract, to then seek accommodation or then navigate the workplace sick leave policies as needed, but not to disclose that information prior to because you have no obligation to do so. If you discover that you need to take some time off from work, and it could be 1 day, 2 days, or perhaps it might be something longer, you do have an obligation to notify your employer, right? So just like there's an expectation for us to show up on time for work, there's an expectation for all employees to notify their employers if they're not going to be able to be in the workplace. And in addition to that, your responsibility and your obligation is also to establish your entitlement to sick leave. Now, a sick day or a short-term sick leave is a pretty low bar in Ontario and most jurisdictions in Canada. It may be sufficient to provide a doctor's note that says, you know, if it's me, dear employer, Saneliso is not going to be able to come to work from Monday to Friday of the week of April 15th. And that's all, right? It doesn't provide any information about what the nature of the illness is. It doesn't provide any information about why beyond the fact that I'm sick and or injured. It just notifies the employer that I will be away and the period of time that I'm expected to be away. Now, let's say that illness extends beyond. So if I'm having a flare-up and the flare-up is lasting for more than the 1 or 2 days I initially thought, I would need to provide updated information to the employer, and that's only to establish the ongoing need for me to be absent from work. So generally speaking, all that you need to do is let your employer know you're going to be sick and the expected duration. There is no expectation that your doctor's estimate is going to be 100% on. And so if there's a need for that absence to be extended, you just need to update the information and make that available to the employer. Whereas in the case of accommodation, so you're at work and you recognize that there is a need for some modifications to your working arrangements in order for you to be able to show up fully and participate in the workplace. And perhaps that is a flexible working arrangement, whether that's work from home some days or work in the office or some sort of modification in your office. I, for example, have sciatica, and so I need a special chair at my desk in order for me to be able to sit at my desk for long periods of time. And I also need a stand-sit desk so that I can stand for other periods of time when I'm having a flare-up of my sciatica. So in order to get those accommodations in the workplace, I have to make a request. There is no expectation that an employer will anticipate folks' needs for accommodation in the workplace. Now, that request for accommodation does not require me to disclose to the employer what my diagnosis is, right? All it requires is for me to communicate to the employer that I have some sort of limitation or restriction that is medically based, which requires an accommodation. And once you've made that bit of the disclosure to the employer has a duty to accommodate you up to the point of undue hardship, which is a strange legal term to say they have a duty to accommodate you, but only to a certain point. And generally that point looks like a point where the employer has to reorganize its own workplace in order to accommodate the individual. Most courts in this country have determined that there's no requirement for an employer to rearrange its workplace in order to accommodate someone. But if there are steps that can be taken to modify someone's work to some degree, or to adjust working arrangements, that is usually thought of as reasonable. And so the other side of that coin is that while the employer has a duty to accommodate, you as the individual have an obligation to cooperate in the accommodation process. And so that means participating in employer processes, whether that's, accommodation meetings or accommodation planning, as well as providing some information. And the information, again, that's generally necessary in order to trigger the duty to accommodate is what are the limitations and restrictions. So for me, for example, it's sitting at my desk for long periods of time. Sometimes it includes information about whether or not there's any treatment or medications that might affect my ability to perform my job. So, there have been points where my sciatica has been tremendously flared up and I've had to use pretty significant painkillers that did affect my ability to work. So my employer doesn't necessarily need to know what those medications are, but they may need to know that I'm undergoing a course of treatment that will impact my ability to do certain tasks at work. Whether or not the disability is permanent or temporary. So whether or not the employer will have to have this accommodation in place for the duration of your employment, or is this something that comes and goes? So when we think about rheumatic diseases, whether or not it's flare-ups that come and go, or whether there are certain limitations or restrictions that are constant for you as an individual that require permanent accommodation. The nature of the illness or injury, and that doesn't mean the diagnosis, but it may mean how it affects your you being present in the workplace. And then all of that information would likely come from a medical professional or a healthcare professional. And so what your employer might also be entitled to know is how those conclusions about the limitations and restrictions and your needs were reached. And so whether it's self-report or whether your doctors or your healthcare team conducted exams or tests to determine what your limitations and restrictions are. So the other thing to keep in mind is that no individual person is entitled to receive their preferred accommodation. So while something like a flexible work arrangement may be your preferred accommodation, as a matter of law, none of us are entitled to our preferred accommodation. It may be the case that that's what we end up getting, but it's important to remember as an individual or when we're supporting our loved ones that the accommodation that we think is the best may not be the accommodation that we get, and that does not make that accommodation illegal or deficient. It may just mean that perhaps that working environment, if they're not able to meet you where you're at and come to the same conclusion, may not be the best working environment for you. The other piece of this is to remember that your healthcare team has a very important role to play. That role is not to identify a specific job that someone should do, but the role is to identify what the disability or illness related needs and restrictions are and to communicate those to the employer. And I think an important piece of that is making sure that your healthcare team understands the job that you're doing. So if I'm working at Starbucks as a barista, I need for my healthcare team or whoever on that team is providing the medical documentation to my employer to understand what I do in that job and to understand what other tasks might be available to me in that workplace. I might be assigned to be a barista, But if there's a day where I can't handle the cups and the hot liquid, maybe I can work on cash. But if my doctor is not able to articulate that there are other tasks that I am able to perform, despite whatever limitations and restrictions I'm experiencing, then they can't put that into the medical note that they're providing. And what I have found is, as someone who advocates exclusively on behalf of employees in my work, is that it's often spoon feeding that type of information to an employer that assists them in coming to the same conclusion as the employee and their healthcare team about what the right accommodation is, right? Letting the employer know what you can't do, but also what you can do within their workplace often helps you to get closer to that preferred accommodation. So when we think about what information your employer is entitled to, there's always a balance that the law plays between the employee's privacy and an employer's legitimate interest. The courts recognize fully that employees, and in particular medical health information, is amongst the most private and inherently sort of private information that exists, and that it's worth protecting. And so an employer is only entitled to the information that they need to know how to manage the workplace. They aren't entitled to information just because they're curious. So they only get the information that is necessary in order to develop the accommodation plan or to ascertain themselves about your entitlement to a sick day or sick leave. So when we think about sick days and sick leave, like I said, they will need confirmation that you're unable to work due to illness or injury, and confirmation that the absence is legitimate. And that usually means having a note from a healthcare professional to confirm that the absence is illness or injury related. Sometimes it'll include the length of the absence so that they can address their operational needs. And other times it may also include information about whether you could come back to work sooner if they put an accommodation plan in place. For accommodations, your employer is usually entitled to more information. So again, that's the limitations and restrictions so that they can put in place the reasonable accommodation, as well as any information to confirm the legitimacy, that's what bona fides means, of those limitations and restrictions. So how can you be your best advocate? Like I said at the beginning, be familiar with your workplace policies regarding sick leave and accommodation. I think Alison made a great point. Asking for those in the interview process or early in your employment is great. And all you need to say is, I just want to have the information in the event that I need it, right? Or asking general questions about whether the employer can tell you about their sick leave and accommodation policies. Talk to your healthcare team first. Make sure your healthcare team is aware if you feel like you are struggling in the workplace and you might need some help. Talk to them. They're the experts, in addition to yourself, on your health, and they can help you figure out how to navigate giving the appropriate amount of information to your employer to get your needs met in the workplace. I think, Alison, you raised an amazing point about communicating in writing and asking for responses in writing. Communicate in writing as much as you can so that you've got a record of it. And I think, Alison, I would just add one modifier to your suggestion to ask if you can send a follow-up. Send a follow-up email. If you have a conversation with someone on the phone or in person or on Zoom, just send the email afterwards to say, I'm writing to confirm our conversation, which was as follows, blah, 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 blah. And even if they don't confirm via email that they agree, or if they write back to say that they disagree with your interpretation, you still have the record of what your understanding was at that time. And that's what's most important if and when you ever have to go to the point of litigation, which I hope that none of you do. And if you do feel like you're being discriminated against, please, please, please seek legal advice. Most provinces and territories have a law society, which provides usually a referral service that can get you at least 30 minutes of free legal advice and consultation with a lawyer. Ontario certainly has one, and I'm fairly confident every province and territory also has one. So please take advantage of those. Most human rights tribunals have an associated legal clinic across the country where you can also seek advice. And there are lots of lawyers out there who do low or no cost consultations, particularly around human rights matters. So please seek the advice, even if it's a 30-minute conversation. Getting some specific and directed advice about your circumstances can go a long way. So that is all for me, and I'm happy to open the floor up to questions.
Thank you so much, Saneliso. That was like actually fascinating. I sat here and I was like, so many times. And you often think of legal like in the worst case scenario at the end, but it's a real structure that can help like really introduce and carry through the whole relationship without. So that was a really amazing presentation. Thank you so much. With that, I would like to welcome everyone to turn their cameras back on who participated in our panel today. And we'll get right into our Q&A, which we will end up just kind of going around a bit. But if you have anything to add, also feel free to jump in. One question that I just thought was great to start with right away, and I think Evelyn, you would be excellent, and with Natasha as well, to answer this question, was from Sarai, and it was just, is there a name or way to distinguish people who grow up with arthritis as opposed to those who get this condition as adults?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you so much. So in terms of what it's called, it's juvenile arthritis, whether you get it, like basically, sorry, let me just restart. Anytime you get diagnosed with arthritis and your symptoms start before the age of 16, it should be technically classified as juvenile idiopathic arthritis. And then there's different subtypes to it as well. When you become an adult, you still have juvenile arthritis, so it should still be referred to as that. But often it gets reclassified in the adult world as rheumatoid arthritis, but it's not, it's still juvenile arthritis. The benefit, though, of calling it sometimes rheumatoid arthritis, that you kind of get access to a few more drugs options in the adult world, and often, and it's like a silly thing, nothing to do with medical, but like the billing code, there's only one for rheumatoid arthritis, whether you're a kid or an adult. So like there's just like silly logistical things, but at the end of the day, you'll always technically have juvenile arthritis. I hope that helps. I still think it's sort of on the same spectrum, and you know, arthritis is arthritis and it can cause the same morbidities no matter when you get it. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Natasha.
No, I think that was perfect. I would say don't concentrate so much on the naming of it. We know you have juvenile arthritis. My oldest one is 76. So it's really more of a logistical thing on our end that we sometimes need to label it differently, but we know you have juvenile arthritis and you always will.
Amazing. So another question, I think, Alison, I think this was addressed through the presentations, but maybe we'll just go back to your personal experience, Alison, of when you brought up your diagnosis when applying for a job, if you did at all, which we heard clearly from Saneliso that you do not have to.
Yeah, I've gone both ways. So there's sometimes I haven't mentioned it at all, and sometimes I do. And it depends on how I feel about the employer. It also depends on, sometimes it comes up in conversation and it's something that I feel comfortable sharing. I am lucky enough to say that I've never brought it up and had a bad reaction or felt like that was the reason that I didn't get a position or a role. Obviously I can't confirm to that, but it's just more of like what I'm comfortable with and how the interview process is going, and if I did feel like it was relevant at the time.
Interesting. Yeah. And Arif, I know some of the research that you presented on some of like the needs and accommodation based on disclosure or non-disclosure, was that on specific diagnosis disclosure or more generalized, these are the accommodation and challenges I face disclosure?
Yeah, so when we ask folks about disclosure, we ask them about whether or not they've disclosed and how much they disclose. And typically what we find is that when people do decide to disclose, they tend to only disclose what they need to disclose. And so sometimes that's not like a robust medical history. It's just like, I am not feeling well today, or I have pain because of my arthritis, and that's why I'm not able to work. But again, I think one of the biggest points is oftentimes that doesn't happen until there's a crisis situation, and that means that things are at its worst. And so that can be quite challenging, and that's a kind of big theme that pops up in our research.
Thank you. Saneliso, I learned so much in your presentation, and I feel like I want to qualify every question with what I learned. But so I understand from your presentation that you do not have to disclose before you have a job, that accommodation begins once you have the job. So the question was, what can my child have ready as documents to speak to a future employer? And what rights do they have as someone with a disability? And I guess maybe a spin on that question, now knowing what we know, would be when you're about to have an initial accommodation or conversation about workplace needs, should you already have a letter from your healthcare in hand, or does that come later?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will really depend on the employer. I think a lot of employers, larger organizations, so like whether it's from Starbucks to Aritzia at the mall or like any sort of large corporation, they will likely have a form that they're going to want your healthcare provider to fill out. Like that's a pretty standard practice in large corporations these days. A smaller organization may not have that. And so having a note from your doctor is a great way to start. And it can be as simple, and I often encourage people to get a very simple note to start off, that all it says is, you know, Evelyn requires XYZ accommodations, or Evelyn has XYZ limitations and restrictions. And I'm picking on Evelyn because we're friends. So, and that's it, right? And let the employer ask the questions they need to ask in order to fashion the accommodation. And you only have to respond to the questions that you have to respond to. And so that's the piece about looking at the policies that exist and about what the specific laws are in the area that you are, because they can vary from province to province or territory to territory. But once you notify the employer of the need for accommodation, they, in addition to the duty to accommodate, have a duty to inquire. They must ask questions in order to figure out the accommodation. And if they fail to do that, then they're in trouble, right? So I think it's giving them the bare bones, like Arif said, give them what they need to sort of get the process started, then let them ask the question, right? And if you need a gut check on whether or not those questions are appropriate questions, lots of healthcare providers are aware of what is and isn't appropriate. But also I think lots of the resources that Arif highlighted will likely have some of that information. And again, checking online, like I can't say enough, I know it's Ontario centric, but the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario and the Commission have really, really great resources that spell out, at least in Ontario, what the employer does and doesn't need to know or can and cannot ask. And so that sort of like, give them the bare bones to get it started would be good, but it's also not necessary. It is enough to say or write in an email, I think I require some accommodations. Can someone help me out? That's enough to get the ball rolling.
Thank you. Natasha, are those accommodation letters, as like it sounds like obviously at the transition clinic, that's something you guys are really supporting patients through all aspects of their life, but is that as readily available with an adult rheumatologist?
Yeah, absolutely. You just have to ask. It's not something in the adult side we're going to know to kind of be proactive about. Sometimes when I know somebody's really struggling and I'm aware that they're working full-time plus hours at this at this job that I know could potentially flare their disease, I'll bring it up, but it's not common because we're just trying to juggle so many different things. So we really rely on the patient bringing it up. I'm kind of like Saneliso, I tell my patients, you don't have to say much. I would say the less, the better. It's surprising how many people say, no, it's okay. I've already told my higher ups. And I'm like, okay, but I tend to write my letters to be quite vague. I will say it is hard to write a letter preemptively. So it's hard to kind of, when people say, I'm like, what do you want me to say? Right? Like, because I don't want to say the diagnosis and we don't really know what the job is yet. We don't really know what the ask is. So I get the security of having a letter in hand, but sometimes it's hard to do that when we don't know the details.
Right.
And just to piggyback on that, that being said too, I think a lot of the folks on the call also may be going to schools. And schools and higher education, they have disability offices on campuses, and we do advocate and remind students, have you linked up with the disability office? It's very different than an employer, and they're there to help and to give you accommodations. Even if someone's like, oh, my disease is well controlled, I don't need them, I still encourage. And usually that it's as an email or going in person, getting a package and then having us fill it out. And it's our pleasure, in case there's a flare or anything untoward, then we can help out that way. Or the school rather can help out that way.
Just to piggyback off Evelyn, schools, whether it's an elementary school, high school, or a post-secondary institution, they also have a duty to accommodate. So like, you are exercising your human rights by doing that, no matter the organization.
Excellent. Alison, someone was curious about your move from Canada to the US and just how US healthcare worked for yourself as someone with a rheumatic disease.
So as an international student, you're required to pay into required to pay into health insurance. And the health insurance that comes with schools, I looked at a few, are very comprehensive. I do remember my parents had also read through, like they covered my biologic in full. And they did cover, there was a stipulation in there that said, we will not cover anything TMJ related unless it's due to a degenerative joint disease such as arthritis. So that was in place. So the schooling, it was basically covered in my fees. And the transition from Canada to the US was very easy because there's a lot of medical providers and it's a paid system. Transition from US back to Canada was difficult. Transition from Canada to the UK has been almost impossible, sadly. But so it's what I would recommend to anybody at this point is keep your records, document them, because it goes such a long way, especially if you make any move, whether it's city, province, country.
Excellent. We probably just have time for two last questions. So one, Haley asked, so as opposed to, when you're sick or need accommodation, people with rheumatic disease often have frequent medical appointments. And she asked about what about disclosing when you have to do a health check or a clearance appointment?
Yeah, I would say if you have to do an appointment, it really depends on the workplace policies about whether or not you have to disclose the purpose of it. If you feel like you have to disclose, I would start off by saying doctor's appointment. And again, sort of vagueness that I think we've all been echoing. Start there. If they push and ask for more information, I think that your response should be, can you let me know which policy requires me to disclose the nature of my appointment? Right. And that may get your manager or supervisor to be like, oh, I don't know. And it may have just been a curious question. If it's like a health check for the employer or some sort of like pre-employment qualification, because some of those exist, really, again, look at the policies. Employers have the duty to accommodate, including in an interview process and pre-employment sort of checks and things. However, if there is again, that word bona fide, occupational requirement that requires something, and the things I always jump to are like firefighters, police, those types of professions where there are a sort of physical requirement that often intersects with disability and illness or injury. Take a look at what the policies say, because those are some of the limited circumstances where, in effect, the employer is allowed to discriminate because it's been established that those requirements are necessary for the performance of the job. And so you just want to be sure about what the rules are, what, if any, law exists out there about it. And you can often find that information via Google, but ask questions if you have a concern about that type of thing.
Excellent. I think we have a really good basis on our rights, on the kind of supports that could be provided through healthcare, what a real experience looks like from our amazing young adult speaker. And so I think the last question that we'll end with, and Arif, because you scanned so many young adults with rheumatic disease in your research, I think you might be good to weigh in on this one. But what types of jobs are good to pursue for people with rheumatic disease?
Yeah, I don't think I have a clear answer on that. I think one, you have to be passionate about your job. Two, the environment has to be correct and right for you. Two, you need to be aware of what you can and cannot do. And if you feel like you can't do it, are there resources, accommodations, or adaptations that will still allow you to do it? Uh, and yeah, I think the best job is one that brings you happiness and fulfillment and allows you to sustain a quality of life that will make you happy. And I think that's a critical kind of it's a kind of evidence that probably aligns with all of our lives, and that would probably be the answer that I would provide to that.
Thank you. And would anyone else like to weigh in on the last question? Amazing. Well, thank you very much to everyone who participated in our webinar today. Please take a look in the comments because you're getting a lot of thanks from everyone who watched. This was super beneficial, and we'll be really excited to post this online at cassieandfriends.ca. So all the information, the recording, and resources will be available there. And I know Brittany is going to advance the slide, and we'll quickly close out with our session with huge thanks to everyone. We just wanted to remind everyone, the parents especially online, that we do have a Juvenile Arthritis Canada Facebook group. We're almost up to 800 members, and this is an incredibly supportive group that you can go to share stories. A lot of people want to share successes, but also delve into some of the challenges that you may face, and also just not have that sense of isolation and aloneness. So there is community there for you, and I encourage you to join it. Next slide, please. We have some really amazing events coming up. Sunday, May 5th, there are 2 events. So we have a Juvenile Arthritis Family Day Conference happening in Toronto. This is actually our first conference since beginning of COVID, and this is just the start. So if you do not live in Toronto, or you aren't attending this event, please know that we are committed to bringing Family Day conferences which serve every member of the family, including siblings, from toddlers to young adults as well, to across Canada. Also happening on Sunday, May 5th, if you are in the Toronto or Aurora area, we are having our first ever Scoring Goals for Juvenile Arthritis charity hockey game. We are welcoming spectators, and we also still have room for players. So if you are a hockey player and are interested in either playing in our main game or in our kids shootout happening at intermission, this is a really amazing, unique event. We are partnered with the Understanding for Childhood Arthritis Network research group. So there will be international researchers from juvenile arthritis around the world, clinicians, patients, parents, kids, and family members all together for this event. And finally, we have our Team Cassie and Friends run walks happening all across Canada. You can see our next 4 races here. But if you check out cassieandfriends.ca/run, you'll see all our events across Canada. And you do not need to be an advanced runner. Many of our community members walk, and it's just an incredible feeling to have an opportunity to connect and to do something really positive and get active together, and really start spreading more awareness about juvenile arthritis, which we also heard all throughout this presentation is a barrier that continues. So together we can really move the needle on public awareness and make some of these conversations that youth have ahead of them much easier in the community. Next slide. Definitely keep in touch. cassieandfriends.ca is our website. You can email us anytime with questions. If you had a question that you didn't get answered today on this webinar, please do follow up with us at info@cassieandfriends.ca. We also have a lot of information posted across our social media, so we look forward to connecting with you there. And as always, Cassie and Friends is a registered nonprofit in Canada. We are the only dedicated nonprofit to the juvenile arthritis and other rheumatic disease community, and we are thrilled to be able to not only provide services and support to fund research, but also are a very proud employer of several youth with rheumatic disease. And we hope to continue to be here to serve families and really help youth just thrive and reach their fullest potential. So if you are able, please do consider making a donation. And with that, I will wish everyone a good night. Thank you so much again. This was just an incredible presentation, and we really thank you. And I can't wait for number 5, Natasha and Evelyn. See everyone later. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Arif. Thank you, Saneliso. Bye.